Hey, fellow G&Ters, those of us like our spirituality with a twist. So today we're continuing on with the discussion of what historians call the proto-orthodox branch of Christianity. This is part of a bigger project that we've had ongoing, which is like America, what the hell? Now we've been trying to figure out the different reasons why our particular land is in the particular terrible shape and position it's in. And rather than doing it kind of like as an issues of the week kind of a thing, though maybe we'll do a little of that today. Because we're an educational, spiritual kind of a podcast, we've been trying to look at it through like that lens. And the subject matter here is a major and probably unfortunate part of what's happening in America now is a kind of a toxic Christianity. And we've been really trying to look at not just that part of Christianity, but Christianity overall, raise some questions about it, think about it a little bit more deeply, think about the parts that are toxic, the parts that aren't toxic. And this group called the Proto-Orthodox is really important because, when historians look at this, you have this kind of all these streams of Christianity that flow into the present. And this is the one that probably is, you have to say, part of what's the most problematic group of all of this. So we're going to continue discussing that a little bit because there's a few more things to say. I'm going to share my little diagnostic model on it that I'm going to call the HIPEE model. And I'll tell you what that is in a little bit. We're trying to figure out what's wrong with this type of Christianity. But in any case, good times. And we'll continue on talking about things that we think are important to help all of us hopefully understand this better. But before we get into the details of it, if you can do the thing that everyone asks you to do, which is like and subscribe and maybe share an episode with a friend, write a review, that would be appreciated. Again, we're trying to cover the things that we think are really important. And if you can kind of share our work, we'll get more important things out to more people. So thanks so much for that.
And it's free.
It's also free.
Right.
Yeah. So you'd be doing us a solid on something that's free.
Right.
um, okay. You know what hit me during the week, Daniel, and the reason why I wanted to continue this a little bit more was often we find ourselves kind of on the pulse of things. I can give us credit for that. We are right in the sweet spot. Sometimes we're there even a little bit sooner. But there was an article I came across from one of the editors of The Atlantic. He's a guy named Peter Werner. I don't know him outside of this article. But basically the article was MAGA Jesus is not the real Jesus. And I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what we've been trying to talk about for, these few episodes that we've been working our way through this. And so again, I had this feeling a little proud of us. We can give ourselves a little credit that we're kind of right on the, like, as you'd say, right on the pulse of where things are. And I felt kind of good about that. I don't know. What do you think about that? I think we've been really in kind of like sometimes even a little bit in advance of what people are talking about. We've been kind of getting there.
Yeah, well, there's certain, I think, aspects of society that are ripe for the picking in terms of diagnostics. If you're an honest actor, or I don't want to say an honest actor, an unbiased actor or less biased actor, right? So we don't have any particular desires for something to be wrong or something to be right. It's not like I'm more progressive, in my politics, but I don't care for a certain side to be right. I don't choose this color because I want them to be right. I don't really care, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to something like the fabric or the makeup of a particular society, when you want to try and see some of the reasons for which they ended up the way they ended up, you have to go back at some of the threads that make that. And without a doubt, this country was, founded on the beliefs and the efforts of Puritans, right? Puritanical religious folks. So this thread, it still runs through, even, and especially now, and it's never gone away. So without taking that into consideration is just not being ideologically honest.
Yeah, and I think that whole idea of threads was really striking me too. I like that phraseology and that image because I think you feel like there's a thread that goes all the way back through a system of ideas, right? Or a system of beliefs or a system of religious practice or something. You can really find the threads stretching out of the origin of things. One of the things for me with this, and we've been talking about, is like my gut reaction to this is kind of like a Zen person and as a tantrika and so on has been like, well, there's no real Jesus. You get to choose amongst your Jesuses, right? And that's been one of the main points. Again, with the idea that this can be kind of liberating, right, to be able to do that. But as I was listening to different people talk about it during the week, and again, I was listening to the guy from the Atlantic, and he was talking with another guy who is, they're kind of conservative Christians, like the way it would have been historically, but they're the people who kind of got off of the MAGA train. And there's a group of people who are like that, but they would consider themselves to be the real Christians too.
Right.
So there's still the argument of who the real Christians are. And, we're recording not too far distant from MLK Day. And I was thinking about him a lot, talking with students about him a lot over the past couple of weeks too. And, his message seems obviously always powerful, always profound, but feels even more powerful and profound as time goes on, right? Like it doesn't diminish at all. And for what we were talking about, we did more on this a couple of episodes back, but we were talking about these Dulcinian Christians who were sort of more the precursors of a kind of a social justice Christianity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so their beliefs were more on the idea of release from oppression, release from like false entrenched power, a new society based on equality and mutual aid and respect and shared resources and equality amongst different people and equality amongst different genders and so on. And that's kind of like the MLK Christianity. And it's been there the whole time too, going back hundreds of years as we talked, but that's the MLK one, right?
Right.
And I was like thinking about this, piece, like, if you want to find that, you can find that, which got me thinking also, as I was listening to different people talk about this, people who were talking about comparisons to like talking about the civil rights movement in comparison to things that are going on now. So I wanted to share like kind of interesting point. I'll get your feedback on this, Daniel, and give us all something to think about. Because one of the things that happened as like a news of the week is that there was a church protest that happened in Minnesota, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like this, the journalist Don Lemon was involved in this, and it's not obvious whether the government's going to like try to prosecute him or not. But one of the things I was, kind doing my research for our pod during the week, and one of the things about that is that particular church is not just like any church they were in. First off, the guy who was running the church is a guy named David Easterwood. I'll give his name, so we all can know who he is. And he's an ice field director who's the head of that church.
Correct.
So they didn't go into any old church.
No.
Plus, on top of that, that church is part of a group of churches that would fit into our idea of like the proto-orthodox, right? And it's the church of Pete Hegseth, our Department of War / Defense guy. And
Mm-hmm.
this is part of like a very reactionary Christian group, which is called the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. And the guy who's the head of that, if you don't know these names, is a guy named Doug Wilson. And we'll have maybe more on him later, but he's the kind of guy that wants to repeal the 19th Amendment, have women not vote,
Oh.
do all kinds of funky shit. So it's not like, it wasn't like a just
Random.
rando thing,
Right.
The guy who's that particular also related to that church in Minnesota is a guy named Joe Rigney, and he wrote this book called The Sin of Empathy,
Mm.
which is like a treatise on how you have to remove empathy from Christianity. And as you were talking about last episode, even Daniel, you remove the empathy from Christianity, really what do you have left? It's the heart of the whole thing. So
Right.
it wasn't like a random thing that these people were doing. We could debate whether you should do it or not, but it's an act of civil disobedience. And then again, researching for the pod, and one of the guys I was listening to was a guy named Robert P. Jones. Really interesting guy. He was like originally like a Southern Baptist.
Bobby P.
Yes, a different Bobby P. Jones. Yeah, the glorious RPJ. So anyways, he's from like Jackson, Mississippi, deep Southern Baptist guy. And I don't know what happened to him. I don't know his whole story. But at some point he sort of had whatever his enlightening experiences are. And he was like, we got a real problem with obviously racism within Christianity. And we gotta like look at that in a more direct way.
Right.
But the thing that he said was fascinating was that this was one of those kind of protests that really have a historical root too. which go back to kind of this protests in the 1960s,
Uh-huh.
where people would do actions in churches that had racist aspects,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And I
Yep.
thought, well, that's a fascinating take on that. And he brought up, I was just searching on the phone, he brought up Medgar Evers, which is a kind of a name that a little bit, from like your education in the civil rights movements and the MLK times back in the early 60s. And I think, Robert P. Jones, the guy who's, I was listening to talk about this, maybe brought him up because he happened to be killed at the age of 37 too.
Yes.
The same age as we'll talk about him, one Alex Preddy. Everyone knows now this name, right? This poor guy who was the ICU VA nurse, right, who was shot. So I think
Mm-hmm.
he was referencing to that too. But his point was this whole tradition of like doing these kinds of protests, even though they might feel aggressive, they're not, there's a deep history of them too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you think of it, what it really is, I think, for our conversation is it's one kind of Christianity protesting against another kind of Christianity, right? We have
Mm-hmm.
two streams. We have the stream that maybe MLK is representing or Medgar Evers is representing, right? Which is this justice oriented Christianity, which has a root to it. The way you were
Right.
talking about threads, those threads go back,
Yeah.
right? And like, again, like the way that the people who were inquisited and killed, this Medgar Evers is killed too, right? But the threads are there. And
And he was a veteran at first.
yeah, yeah, he was a veteran too.
Yeah, he served in World War II.
Yeah, yeah, he was a veteran as well. Yeah. So, the point that's being made is when you trace the threads back, you're like, yeah, there's always been, this is like Christianity on Christianity conflict, or you could say Christianity on Christianity violence. I wouldn't be shocked. I don't know anything about him. But if Alex Preddy turned out being Christian, would that be surprising? No.
No.
But he was following a different stream, a different thread of the Christianity. And what I didn't quite get as far as the threads go, because again, I think for this Robert P. Jones, the guy from Jackson, Mississippi, he's now involved in doing a lot of research on toxic Christianity, the phrase that we've been using. He uses just like white Christian nationalism. He puts the white in there. But the point that he's bringing up is even if you trace the roots back in the Southern Baptist Convention, which I didn't know the history of that, but that goes back before the Civil War. And the main point of that organization was to have churches that they could isolate from members that they didn't want in the church.
Mm.
So the whole idea was we're not going to allow people of color into our church. And that's the origin of that organization, right? And so that thread is kind of there from the beginning. And so it made me really feel, like think about what was happening there. It's like I found it to be very valuable to think about, that it's really
Yeah.
a kind of Christian protest against another kind of Christianity that they're trying to break through, right? And that changed the meaning of it for me. And the matter of fact, the guy who killed Medgar Evers was just another Christian guy. It was a
Yeah. I
Southern
mean, he was a
Baptist.
Ku Klux Klan member.
Yeah. So it's a kind of like a toxic version against something that you'd say is the more MLK version that goes back when
Mm.
people are trying to fight for equality amongst people, right? Under God,
Mm-hmm.
right? In a spiritual and religious sense. So, anyways, I thought that was important and interesting to share. And the other little thing I had on news of the week, which I thought was on the pulse, was about the Alex Preddy shooting. I just wanted to say, that's been obviously everyone's digesting that all the time now.
Yeah.
But the one thing I wanted to point out about it is like, why do they keep calling people domestic terrorists? Like, what is that about? Right. And you could have multiple reasons why you'd be motivated to do that if you were trying to be in more authoritarian government. But I just wanted to point something out that maybe as an educational thing, people might not be familiar with. So there's a thing called NSPM7,
So, yeah. Yeah.
National Security Presidential Memorandum 7.
That's correct. And I don't know what
And
happened in the first six, but I know this one is, yeah.
yeah, this one's jumping out now. And the fact that it's 7 means they're pretty rare, right?
Yeah.
So you got lots of history of country and you don't do it very often. And it came out 2025. And basically what it did, and how I saw this back to our subject matter, is how much it kind of goes around this idea, again, this sort of more maybe toxic or proto-orthodox Christianity, because basically what it is it's an executive order signed by the president that basically says, here's the attitude we're going to take to something. And in this case, it was the attitude towards law enforcement. And it basically is like, here's the people we're going to label domestic terrorists.
Mm-hmm.
And when you really look at what it says, and what I wanted to try to show, for this part of the conversation, is that the checklist of what's there is like strongly influenced by, again, what we might call this sort of more proto-orthodox, toxic kind of Christianity. So I did the list of the things that they were like saying are like terrorist indicators, or what makes you a terrorist. And like part of that list is you're anti-Christian, but that means anti-Christian in like a certain way. It certainly means like you're anti-our Christian, but the whole idea of being anti-Christian makes you a domestic terrorist. So that's
Correct.
anti-Christian is one. Anti-traditional American family values on religion, on morality, on how the family should be, proto-orthodox stuff, right? And that gets entwined with like anti-capitalism. And
Correct.
depending on how we want to do this in the future, maybe we should do something on capitalist Christianity, because that's a bizarre thing too, right? We want to make
Mm-hmm.
that a stream of Christianity. And then if you have contrary views, which they say are extreme views, but contrary views on gender or race or immigration. And all
Mm-hmm.
that stuff can potentially makes you domestic terrorist. So I just wanted to point it out, like when they keep saying people are domestic terrorists, that's not coming out of nowhere exactly. And it's not entirely just propaganda. It's referencing back to how they define this now, right?
Right.
And when I look at those lists, I'm like, well, okay, I guess I'm a domestic terrorist. Because a lot of this stuff I'm not going to agree with them on.
Right.
So you're redefining a whole group of people that now you can label a domestic terrorist if you feel like doing this, right?
This
But
is
then at the
very
end, you say all of that is anti-American. So, anyways, I just wanted to point that out. People aren't familiar. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Daniel. Sorry.
this is very McCarthyistic, right? For those who don't know, he was a senator.
Yeah, Wisconsin,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. In like 1950, in the late 40s, early 50s. This was like during the kind of communist, getting into the kind of just creeping into the Cold War period after the sort of honeymoon phase of the World War II, and Reconstruction and all that stuff was sort of like phasing out. You had like what they called McCarthyism, which is which was they called it a rooting out of people who were pro-communist, right? And so they had these like blacklists of people who were communists, which is still a stigma today. But back then, it was that was the worst thing that you could be called, was a communist, because at this point we were making the Kool-Aid, we were selling it, but then we were also drinking the Kool-Aid at the same time. So we had this Kool-Aid factory, and you could just put anybody on there,
Yeah.
anybody you didn't like. You just they're reading, whatever, Dostoevsky, so they're definitely a communist, or they're whatever it is.
Mhm.
And this was used very nefariously, obviously highly politically motivated, and lots of people were caught up in it. Their lives were ruined over it. And this is much of the same thing. And it's interesting because I don't think that people really have a good grasp at the consequences of this if it sticks around, and it is, unfortunately, it's here. Fortunately, it's an order, that can be wiped out with just tearing up a paper, or somebody else comes in. But, people are very quick to get behind all of the fingers that are pointing at somebody when it's somebody they don't like. And they are willing to be, ideologically extremely flexible, almost to the point of having zero backbone and zero roots in
That's been
anything.
kind of the thing on like the gun control aspect of this. Not that we're gonna go off on it, but like
Yeah, yeah.
gun control, freedom, Second Amendment, Second Amendment. That dude had a gun? No.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
that's
it's a hypocrisy. Yeah.
that's the most recent one, but it's many things, you know. And so as time goes on, if you step back just a hair, you go, oh well, it's only a matter of time before that gets used on you. So better to understand the game to which is being played and how people are being divided. And then you can find yourself on the sides of people you might not have ever thought you could, because you actually have far more in common with them than you realize when stop looking at each other and you look up.
Yeah. Yeah, I was really like struck by when I was thinking about in the context of our episodes with this idea of like how influenced that is by like a certain kind of view of Christianity is like running through that whole thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, you could look at that from different perspectives. Again, I was looking at it from the perspective like, wow, that's really proto-Orthodox. Because like top of the list is you can't be anti-Christian. And
Right.
it doesn't say anti-religious. It doesn't say that. It says you can't be anti-Christian. So you could kind of get the feeling of like what happens when you have a certain view of a certain religious ideology that like wants to seize control. And all of a sudden, all of their ideological features, if you don't share them, you're a domestic terrorist. And it's
Mm-hmm.
easy to label someone then. And so then you listen to people talk and you're like, why does that phrase flow out so easily for people? And it's partially because they've made a legal definition.
Right.
They've done it. So it sounds like it's, if you don't know this, it sounds like it's coming out of left field. Like, why are they saying that? That seems like a stretch. Why are they saying that about this person? Well, the fact that he's anti-immigration or anti something else, bang, makes you a domestic terrorist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or anti their immigration policies. So they've made sort of this template, but a lot of it has to do with, again, like what I guess I would call proto-Orthodox stuff. You have to have a certain view of like religion. You can't be anti-Christian or non-compliant to Christianity. You can't have an alternative view to Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, proto-Orthodox Christianity, what constitutes the family or morality. Like they're just putting that out there. And I thought, well, that's a proto-Orthodox move, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's how you exercise control when you're coming from that ideology. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to explore. So I had a couple of things for the week that I thought, wow, that really hits right on the pulse of what people are talking about. So I thought, we're, again, to use that medical terminology, we're kind of on the pulse of it. Right.
Right.
Yeah. I had like a couple of other deals with this, and I'll get your opinion on it. I was trying to come up with a simple way. As diagnosticians, sometimes what you try to do is you try to come up with like little memory tricks or something
Sure.
things. And I was thinking, okay, hype model, right? Of what proto orthodoxy is kind of about. Because we had gone through how it kind of ticks historically, because we looked at this historical movement, but you can still see the same thing. Like you were saying, the threads are going down to the present, right? So I kind of went like hype with an I. And, the first of these, if we trace it through, would be the H of it I have as being hell, right? So these people come up with this idea that wasn't there within the pagan world, but all of a sudden you make people terrified of going to hell. And you keep getting that at the core of this ideology.
Mm.
And, from when we were talking about cults back in 2025, I spent a lot of time listening to people who were in these religious movements. We had some people on who were guests, right?
Mm-hmm.
On this like thread of hell that kind of like hovers around this. And that goes down to the present day where you still get this idea of like fear of hell and fear of hell kind of as like a dominant thing. And then kind of like the evangelical world, what you get a lot of people talking about is the book of Revelation, right? And that line of Christianity that like goes down to the present day and becomes sort of their source of like fear essentially, and that kind of toxic fear-based religiosity. And
Mm.
when you listen to people who are in these circles, especially people who have gotten out, they're like, wow, I was really terrified of being left behind or tossed into hell, the whole fire and brimstone thing. And maybe it's worthwhile talking about that book, not now, well, maybe we'll get to it at some point, but even that book of Revelation, there's lots of people who feel like that shouldn't be in the Bible like at all, because the imagery that it has in it, especially of Jesus as a figure, is so extreme, right?
Mm-hmm.
You talk about extreme views. I was listening to, like, again, one of the people I trust as a historian around this stuff, Bart Ehrman, and he was pointing out that there's an episode in the book of Revelation. This is Jesus we're talking about as a figure who comes back as kind of like a king, a judge, and essentially kind of like a torturer. and there's like a bit in it where there's a character named Jezebel who's like bad, obviously, but Jesus throws her on a bed in this book and then sends men in to have sex with her. It's not obvious if like she's being raped. It's not clear in the text itself. But there's these men who are having sex with her, and as the babies are born, Jesus kills them. And like that's in that book,
What book is this?
Book of Revelation,
Okay.
Apocalypse of John. And like the reaction that you have to that, mine is similar. What? That's in that book? And again, maybe we'll do something about it at some point or another, just to
We'll
like,
fix it.
yeah, maybe we'll just erase it. But
We'll
yeah,
fix.
it's
Don't worry, we got this.
no, it's one of those things where you're like, obviously people didn't like. There were people who were, obviously Christians who were like, we can't put that fucking book in there. That book's
Mhm.
psycho. There's been resistance to that thing ever since that book has been hanging around. But in these circles where people are really afraid of getting,
Right.
again, my little hype thing, getting afraid of like tossed in the hell, this violent version of like Christianity is like right there.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand. And I remember hearing one of these conservative figures talking at some point over the last 10 years or something. And he was like, well, we're tired of this milk toast, compassion and empathy Jesus. And you're kind of like, what are they talking about?
Hmm.
Isn't that supposed to be the gist of the whole thing? Like for the pod, I actually went through and I was like, I didn't have time to read it, but I was re-listening to Mark, Matthew. I'm actually re-listening to those gospels. And like so many passages of them have all that compassion and beauty in them, right?
Hmm.
So I was doing that for the show, for our little pod, like thinking about those texts. And I remember listening again to the guy going, we're tired of this weak soy boy Jesus. And I was like, where's this coming from? But you realize there's this thing that they're very imprinted on, the hell and then the violent imagery within these things and afraid of getting punished. So anyways, you got thoughts on that? That's the hell part to me. And that's, I think, how you trace that thread into the modern world. It's like it's still there. But anyways, I'll throw it to you, Daniel.
Yeah, that's a mechanism. I mean, it's a mechanism of control,
Yeah.
right? Like you can be given a reward. So people are generally trained, or animals are generally trained, I guess. And some people look at other humans as animals. So we could say that beings are most often trained with consequence and reward. And if you continually give somebody the same reward based on our brain chemistry, dopamine in this case, you will get less and less positive reinforcement for that reward because it's the same thing over and over again. You come to expect it. However, if the consequence is very high, you will do whatever it takes to avoid that consequence because you don't want to know what that's like. You'll work very hard to completely avoid that consequence, especially if you make it, like uh, whatever for eternity. You're going to be, getting coals raked over your tongue for eternity. Like that's a long time. Just this infinite space where that's where you're going to be after you die. You're going there, you know, and you continue to wash this idea over and over and over again. It stays in people's minds and their awareness, and it starts to influence in people's decisions. But it is far easier to control people based off of fear than based off of reward. Turn on the news. What motivates people? Fear, and then anger. That's what they call a motivated voting block. People who are angry and scared about shit. So um, this to me is far less of like divine influence on human psychology and far more man understanding himself and knowing what levers they need to pull to keep their sheep in line.
I'm very interested in what, like, I totally agree. And like, again, I have a lot of compassion because I spent time over the last year since we took up this project, listening to people who were parts of these groups. I mean, I was raised Catholic, so I know something about this, right? Certainly Monsignor O'Day was willing to be a little scary for me, Irish Catholicism, right? but the
Mm-hmm.
people who were in the circles where they were really taking this part very, very seriously. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the people I was listening to, April Joy, she wrote this book called Star Spangled Jesus, and she said she kind of told this story of her girlhood that for some reason her family was out and she had slept in or something. Maybe she was like 11, 12 years old or something like that. And she went out in the house and she literally felt like she was like left behind. And everybody else had been like swept up into the sky in the second coming, and she was stuck on the earth to go through the trials that were going to come down. And she was terrified.
Aren't there books like this?
Yeah, there's the Left Behind series that's
Yes.
big in those circles, you know?
Yeah. Yeah,
And the
planes falling out of the sky and like, because
yeah.
the pilot disappears and like half the families are gone. I don't know if the good half or the bad half left. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, like the people who are good get pulled up in the sky, so they don't have to go through this book of Revelation shit.
Oh, God. Okay.
Because there's going to be, well, I guess it's not that yet, but there's going to be 7 years of tribulations or something where everything's going to be a shit show.
Okay.
But anyways, I mean, it was like you could feel like her fear as a girl, and I was like, okay, like you're saying, that's a powerful motivator. But the
Mm-hmm.
other part that fascinates me, which I think is a major theme through our podcast, even out of these episodes, is like, can you get a spirituality that isn't based around ideas of social control? And I think when we think of the things that are influences of what we're trying to do here, we were talking before we got on mic how you love Zen. That's not about social control primarily, right? That's about something else. Taoism, we're doing Buddhist Tantra a lot. You think about the Sufis and so on. They're not they're not doing the social control version of spirituality. But it's interesting to think if you can get people to a place where you can get belief systems that aren't about social control, because so many are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I see that as a major kind of motivating thing for me and what we try to do here. Yeah. Okay, so that's the H part of it. The I part of it is the ideological part. That what they kind of created again at the root, tracing the threads through, is this idea that you have to have a core belief system. Like we were talking about last episode, in the pagan world, it was more like you can do different things, and it's what you do that matters more than that you have to have this very particular belief system. And you trace that through to the now. Again, people arguing about who the real Jesus is. MAGA Jesus isn't the real Jesus, ours is the real one. But it has a lot to do with having like an ideological commitment that was like out of like traditional like people, traditional like pagans were like, what are you talking about? There's all kinds of ways to get to the divine. And we talked about that. But the thing that struck me is about the now is that it's more important what you believe than what you do, right? So as long as I hurled the right credo and kind of like have the right beliefs, on some level, I'm more divorced from what I actually do to other people. And that strikes me as like kind of a signature of what's going in our present day now, Daniel, for me, right? That when you get to this kind of way of thinking, as long as I say, in this case, Jesus is my personal savior, and I have the right belief system, then even if I do these, within this narrow ideology, I have the right belief. Even if I do terrible things, it doesn't really count,
Right.
right? Because it's more important
Right.
that my belief system that I'm professing matters more than how I treat other people around us. And that's a bizarre thing, but that seems like that's true to me. Do you agree with that too?
Yeah, I think it takes yeah, I mean, it takes the onus off the person, which I think in some sense is supposed to help people with stress, you know? Because I think, the people who created this structure are social psychologists, you know?
Are you seeing like the people who are doing these religious things originally had a social psychology piece to it?
Oh, without a doubt, because
Yeah.
you're looking at implementing something upon society. You're looking at implementing, rules and regulations on top of something. And so therefore you have to do a couple things. You have to merge practices with already pre-accepted timelines, like having Christmas at the time of winter solstice, Yule and where Hanukkah is. You're putting this already at these generally astrological observation periods, right? Easter being near spring equinox, you know? Um, so you have that as part of it. But then the other part is that you look at society as a whole and you say, okay, where do we want to direct things and how do we want to direct them? So as they're like putting this on top of society, but then really kind of rooting it into it, they have this in mind that they're steering the ship. And then they're using this ideology to steer that ship. So I think it's important to understand that like this was created by man to affect other men. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have value or that it's particularly nefarious, but it does say that it is not without intention, and that intention was not given by the person who you are talking about, who these teachings are based around. It was given by somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody else who remembered him. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
And yeah, so you just have to take everything with a grain of salt.
I guess it depends on like, I don't disagree with you. Obviously, by the time, and we'll get to it, by the time you get this being like the religion of the state, well, then you
Hmm.
can really see that that's very clear.
Hmm.
I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on it, but I had an interesting conversation over some steaks last week. I was talking to somebody who's from like the Soviet Union.
Mm.
And it was like, okay, we were just discussing like this kind of history stuff a little bit, because I kind of bounce ideas that we're talking about in the podcast off people that I know. And her reaction was something like, well, it was a kind of like a neo-Marxist reaction, which I get. It was something like, well, these are instruments of social control, you know?
Hmm.
And I don't disagree, but in a weird way, I don't know what the dividing line for these people were between what they believed and what they wanted to impose upon others, especially before it became the religion of the state. But like, no doubt, at one point or another, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit too, it's going to become the religion of the state.
Hmm.
And at that point, well, then you're really talking about how do you control people? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, HI ideology, hell ideology, P is patriarchy. And I just wanted to bring that up again as a distinct thing. We talked about it last episode, but I thought it was worthwhile to go on and try to see how that like even sort of still travels down to the now. The
Yeah.
way it seemed like it worked historically was you'd have the patriarch male figure who was the head of the clan of the family, and they would
Yeah.
decide what was going to happen within that group, especially if you're going to follow a certain religion or something.
Hmm.
And like one of the big ideas within this, and you could still see this pushing now, it's so bizarre to think about, but this idea of women as property.
Mm.
So I was listening to people talking about like Project 2026, which is like coming off the presses. And she was sort of warning like this idea of women as property is within this framework, right? It goes back to this patriarchal root and it's still getting pushed. Again, we were mentioning like the Pete Hegseth Church, this Doug Wilson, they is part of their platform. They want to take away the 19th Amendment and like take away the right to vote and go back to what they're calling householder voting. It's like part of their version of proto-Christian ideology, right? To go back that far, we're going to go back to the head of the household. So what'll happen is you'll have, the married couple and the family, and then only the dude gets the vote. And he'll vote in like for the entire unit. And again, it sounds crazy and hard to imagine that ever happening.
Yeah. No,
But
you have to have,
it is the ideology, right? They want to go back to that. Mhm.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, you need, in order to ratify the Constitution one way or another, you have to have, just to open up, just to have the convention, you have to have approval of 25 states.
Yeah. So it's not like, again, I'm saying that we have to sit there in danger of this happening, but it is
Right.
they're writing about it.
Right. They have a desire for that.
They have a desire for that. And it's not
Hmm.
a bunch of nobodies. It's like Pete Hegseth and Mike Johnson. And like, if you don't know who he is, this other guy, Christian nationalist, total bag of dicks, Russ Vogt. These are like these kinds of people. That's what they're trying to push for. So on the one hand, we can say, okay, they're not going to succeed at that. But one of the things I did want to point out as it's going down to the now, and again, kind of like we were talking about the presidential memorandum stuff, it's pretty subtle. If you're not tuned into these things, it could go past you. But one of
Hmm.
the things that happened was they took a bunch of professions and they canceled them as professions.
Yes.
So if you haven't paid too much attention to it, it resonated for us because acupuncture was one of the ones they canceled. But they basically said these are no longer professions. And when you look at it and you understand what they're
Nursing
trying
is
to
another
do,
one, Eric.
they cut all of the ones that women would be drawn to. They cut all of them. So I can give you a list, right?
And they did that because, well, you're gonna tell why. You'll say why.
Well, I'll give a theory too, and we can both do,
Okay.
but I'll
Okay.
get the list. So they
Okay.
cut nursing is
Yep.
no longer a profession. Physician's assistants, no longer a profession. Physical therapists, no longer a profession. Occupational therapists, not a profession. Audiologists, speech pathologists, caring professions, cut. Educators are no longer professionals. Teachers aren't professionals. Educators aren't professionals. Social workers aren't professionals. Public health people are not professionals. They cut them all. And what I'm trying to point out for this part, and we'll see what you think about this, Daniel, too. But the thing that's striking is those are the professions, the caring professions that are statistically more women.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to cut them out. And they're
Mm-hmm.
trying to minimize them, and they're trying to like make it hard to get independence for women. That's like part of the underlying goal in that. And we can't ratify it and take away your right to vote, but we can economically try to like coerce you. And we'll try
Mm-hmm.
to economically coerce you by like not letting you into professions that you want to go into to be able to make a career and support yourself. And that will force you economically where we want you to go. Anyways,
And
that's my take.
yeah, the
That's yeah.
reason why it is that they don't have them listed as professions is because it makes it much harder for you to get loans for
Yeah.
school.
You can't get the
That's
money to, yeah.
that's all that it's about. Just
And
making
it's
it
gonna be
harder.
it also can be harder to organize. You're not a
Yeah.
professional, so we're not going to allow you to organize. And that would be women organizing within their professions because that's there's something being direct. I mean, you could say men can participate in these professions too. I'm not saying that,
And they do.
but like these are female dominated professions and they're going to try to wipe them out. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to economically control people, and it's sneaky and subtle, right?
Mm-hmm.
We try to drive people out of the caring professions. And I was looking at the numbers, and like they're if you go across the board, these are predominantly female dominated professions, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just looking right now. OT 10 to
Yeah, it's had
15%.
occupational. Yeah.
PT 35%. Nursing, we know, this is going to be a lower one, 12 to 13%. What else was there?
Um, uh, Physical therapists, you already did
Yeah,
that one.
yeah, yeah, about
Social
35%.
workers.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's funny because these are also about 20%. So these
Yes.
are women yeah,
That are
totally.
women dominated fields. And so you're like, well,
Yeah.
what is that about? Why would you do that? What do you care about in that? And like you realize is okay, we're going to cut the money, we're going to cut the funding around it, we're going to cut the respect that the professions deserve, and therefore we're going to like limit your ability to organize. I mean, one of the ways of looking at that is okay, we'll force you into economic dependence. We're going to try to
Mhm.
do that. So I just wanted to share that with people if you haven't heard that. There might be other things behind that too. I'm not saying that's the only thing. But when you get to again, one of the guys who's behind this, Russ Vogt, total bag of dicks. And he's the financial machinations guy. He's the financial Machiavellian person within these circles who's trying to go through and like weave a web, right? Like self-confessed Christian nationalist person. He wants to go back in the time machine or to a certain kind of proto-orthodoxy and dominate people. So, anyways, I wanted to share that too. And again, a couple of these things are subtle points, but if you don't know it, and if you're not paying attention to stuff, you wouldn't have heard it. But
Right.
if you can kind of hear those things, because they're doing a lot, they are
Yeah, yeah.
active, busy bees, right?
Busy bees.
Very nefarious busy bees, and they're doing a lot of stuff, right? So I think if you don't get that the proto-orthodox way of thinking is women are property, you have to see that,
Right.
and then you have a context. We had an episode a while ago where I was like I found myself connecting to like one of the Buddhist goddesses, like Sarasvati, and she was making a big deal about that. You have to get away from this people as property, women as property thing. Has to go. But it's like built into, like you were saying, it's in the threads
Hmm.
or it's in the web. So a couple more quick things, and I got a couple more minutes. Maybe I'll take another 10 and we can kind
Well,
of do
you got the E still.
Yeah, I got the E. So the E, I put two things together. I put evangelicalism and exclusivism. The exclusivism idea is like you can only follow our one thing. So they kind of
Hmm.
came up with that. And then, the evangelical part that we're going to go out and actively convert people, which
Right.
wasn't part of the historical world. Like that just wasn't a thing in the pagan world. And as we talked about, there wasn't, the two things go together because if you don't have exclusivism, you don't have any reason to evangelize,
Right.
or it's not as strong. You could say, hey, Apollo's really cool. You should follow him, but you're not trying to
Hmm.
like pull someone out of everything and get them to convert in this one way into a new thing. And I mean, to me, if I trace that forward, you still had that thing going on, which is partially like we will convert you by force. We will force you into conversion, right? We'll try to compel it, more conversion at like the tip of a sword or the barrel of a gun. Still that kind of vibe is there. More subtly, we'll economically coerce you, or we'll try to do it in other ways, right? To follow what we want you to follow. So that quality is kind of around. And then the exclusivism part, it's so weird because again, it leads to the argument of like our Christianity is the right Christianity. So even within Christianity, it leads to this point of saying, not only do you have to be Christianity, but you have to be our Christianity. And if you're not our Christianity, you're not real Christianity. And it goes on like this. It won't go away. Does that make sense what I'm saying to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like you can't get out of that thing. And like again, I was really struck by the thing from the Atlantic, MAGA Jesus like isn't real Jesus. You're still having this argument. I was listening to Bart Ehrman and he had like a funny anecdote about it. He was laughing about it in the end, though it's ominous in how it sounds, but he said he was talking to someone. He's a former Christian, Bart Ehrman, and the guy is a very devout Christian. And in the end of the conversation, the guy was saying, well, only people who go to my church are the real Christians. And Bart Ehrman
Mm.
was like, you mean like the Southern Baptists, or what are you talking about? And he said, by the end, he realized what the guy was saying was my church,
Right. His only.
mine, mine in wherever it was, New Haven. That's the only one. And you're like, well, that's just crazy. But you could see like the way that this keeps building down to this point, right?
Mm.
Anyway, so that's my hype model. I got one other thing I would share real quick,
Hmm.
and then maybe we'll bounce out of this. But one of the other weird parts about it is I just wanted to point about the conversion of Constantine. I was thinking about that when we were doing these episodes. If you don't know the Constantine conversion story, what happens is he converts because he has a vision of a cross. He puts it on the shields of his soldiers, and then they conquer these other people. And so I just wanted to bring it up because you can realize that that warlike quality, that Roman warlike quality is there at the beginning too.
Yeah.
Right? And so, again, if you want to trace things back to their roots, like you were bringing up, Daniel, that's sitting there in that kind of Christianity. And then, of course,
Mm.
Constantine converts to like the proto-Orthodox version,
Mm.
which gets you to the idea of like Christian authoritarianism or Christian state-sponsored authoritarianism, or if you want to go
Hmm.
fascism, I guess you can say it, right? And I just want to share a little bit about this because um, there's a scholar I listen to on this too named Mark Carrier, and he's an expert in like ancient history, right? That's his PhD. And he was pointing out this very stunning thing, which again, if you don't know much about this, why would you know? So,
Right.
okay. So what happened was before Constantine converts, you have 50 years of civil war and emperors getting murdered left and right, like it's a disaster, right? And this empire is collapsing. So you have 50 years of civil war, and then you have an economic collapse. And in the economic collapse, the way, again, this Richard Carey talks about it, is um, the state goes kind of fascist. It goes kind of authoritarian. This is like a pagan authoritarianism. So they're like trying to oppress all the people so things don't fall apart. And this is really, I guess, if you look at the history of it, when Christian persecutions start, right? More seriously. There are some before then, but there's a real period where, okay, there's going to be some Christian persecutions on a more intense level. I guess
Mm.
before that, you might get, there's all these stories about all the saints being crucified. under the Romans and stuff, but I guess it really didn't happen that often. It was more rare. But this was a period of like actual persecution. The people on the Christian side were like freedom of religion, freedom of time out, freedom of religion, until the empire flips and you go from being a pagan empire before to now you're a Christian empire under Constantine. And then after that, and he says it very bluntly, after that, everything flips. Now the Christian part is in charge, and all that freedom of religion stuff out the window. Poof.
Mm.
And now we're the religion of the state. And then he says it really bluntly. He says, well, okay, maybe if this didn't happen, you wouldn't have this fascist version of Christianity, but you do, right? Which again is not condemning of all Christianities, as we've been trying to say, but you get this version. And in terms of our conversation about the threads, there's a thread that goes through this in that version of it, right? That you can trace back to the very earliest history. And I was very just struck by that for what we're discussing. That there's that one little thread that keeps going through, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has its origin story. I guess like any origin story, any Marvel story, Thanos has an origin story, and then the thread continues. Right. So anyways, I thought that was important to share too, because you wonder, like, why would this thing go so authoritarian? And you're like, well, there's a branch that's been that way the whole time. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyways, I thought that's kind of an important thing to close on the proto-Orthodox, so we can move on to other stuff, but I wanted to share it.
Yeah. I deeply feel like people are, unfortunately, even though they carry the divine spark inside of them, and there's an enlightened aspect to every single being, and hopefully at some point it will awaken, if you want to, however you want to call this. But until that time comes, the reality is that more people than not seek power and control. This has always been the case. And the people who stand in the way of their desire to seek power and control are bugs that get squashed underneath your shoe when you're just walking on a daily basis. You don't sit here and cry over all of them. You know what I mean? Or when we're driving our cars, it's probably even a better example, right? You just clean your windshield wipers off and you go, man, there's a lot of bugs on my windshield. You don't even think about it. It's a nuisance, if anything else, you know? And so in that, the justification to the people who surround them who still hold a moral code and to get the population to not revolt, because every leader, regardless of who they are, fear their population. They may not say it, but they all do, because you cannot, if a legit like 20% of the population was like, fuck it, we're not buying anything and we're burning it down, there's nothing you can do. That you can't control that kind of chaos. So they have to be able to.
That's why the Minneapolis thing is so scary, right? Like it's
Yeah,
harder to control. It's like a grassroots resistance movement. It's a little freaky for people who want to impose control upon others, right? That's what
correct.
yeah.
Correct. So they're always conscious of this, And in this way, it's the psychology of the people, I believe, that twist these teachings for their own benefit, for their own personal gains and aims. And what ends up happening is that they, in my opinion, corrupt these teachings, this ideology, these practices to fit their mold, but they're corrupting it to teach people who don't have critical thinking or don't apply it in this way to challenge them. And so therefore that just gets set. And then once it's set, that's it. Then generations moving forward, they just accept this as the way to be. And they don't question it. And then when they are questioned, they get, subjugated in many different, or ostracized, or, excommunicated, or how, depending on the society. You know what I'm saying? And this is why, the Enlightenment was such an important time, right? Because then you have your life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Granted, this is the seeds of capitalism, but it's also the seeds to reorganizing your mind around what life is. Life obviously being alive, but then liberty meaning your ability to say what you want, to practice what you want, so on and so forth, is a really important piece. And this, changed society in many ways, and we are a product of that. And you and I are, different backgrounds, but raised relatively Catholic, Christian, and influence. And yet we were able to voluntarily and relatively easily go study completely foreign traditions and then bounce around in some of those. And you were able to study some Kabbalistic, meditations and practices and hold those in your heart. And then you went to Tibetan Buddhism and be able to do this. Like there's many things that you were able to do that you didn't have to run around and hide and then go to church on Sundays and do all the rituals with that just so that your family wouldn't be suspicious that you might be, an outsider or have your mind corrupted. You know what I'm saying? No, not at all. And so I don't always say it, but it's been a long time actually. We're lucky to be living in these times that we get to have this. But I firmly believe that the uh, corrupted and selfish mentality of human beings that have a great capacity to harm others and society at the same time are the reasons for why these things still exist because they mirror their own dark desires. Do you know what I'm saying? This is how I think that people can carry this kind of thing through and how it's still alive and very well funded today.
Yeah, it's like such a deep subject, right? When you were talking about the divine spark and all that, that has a Gnostic feeling. We're going to talk about Gnostics at some point, right? We do have
Hmm.
the divine spark, and it's inspiring, but sometimes it also makes you a little sad because one of the things you have
Yeah.
to be really clear about when I think of my relatives who I would say, okay, they're involved in what I'm calling this proto-Orthodox Christianity, and
Hmm.
I don't think it's spiritually liberating. Like if I look at my grandma, like I'm not mad at my grandma. She just was raised in a certain thing and thought a
Hmm.
certain way. And maybe in the end you support things that are kind of ugly, but you're kind of in a certain sense dragged into that because it's more a question of they got you when you were young and you got pulled along into this certain set of beliefs and maybe you never had the opportunity to really fully challenge that, you know,
Hmm.
um, and maybe come to a different conclusion about what it is, right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not. It's that funny tension. If you talk about like again, we can throw out names of people who are involved: Russ Vought and Doug Wilson and Pete Hegseth and Mike Johnson. Blah blah blah. We can go on and all the way up to DJT.
Yeah.
Well, these are corrupt people, right? Living under a kind of a corrupt ideology, and even if you believe it and you're sincere and you're an ideologue, you're still doing something bad, right? Your
Hmm.
ideology is toxic, right? That's as damaging also to you, right? If you want to get into the real spirituality of it, because you're trying to impose your will on others in a way that's negative, right? In a way that's spiritually toxic. But at the same time, I look at my family members who are in this, and I'm not mad at them. I understand that there's something, that they were just kind of brought into this way of thinking and they've never had a chance to pop out of it. Anyways, I think about that too. Yeah.
Parallel lives, man. We're
Yeah.
all we're all living parallel lives next to each other.
And I would say that just to get to what you're saying too, I have had that thought too. I thought, well, this is potentially an amazing time to be alive.
Hmm.
Fingers crossed that we
Fingers
keep
crossed.
going this way. But like in my
Yeah.
lifetime, been able to like meet some Kabbalists and study Kabbalah. I didn't have to travel to Svat to do that, right?
Hmm.
Or I've been able to meet Tibetan Buddhists. I was able to study with Zen masters from Japan. My mentors in our Chinese medical world, our Taoist
Hmm.
mentors, I get to meet those
Hmm.
people. So
I mean,
it's a blessed time and it's a complicated time, but
we're
we
two
should be grateful.
we're two Americans who were able to study Chinese medicine in
Amazing.
Chicago. In Chicago, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I could do all of this stuff without even having to leave the country. I
right.
can
I mean,
read like a text that you'd have to climb to the top of the fucking Himalayas
yeah,
to
even right
find.
now, as
Yeah,
you know, we're recording this right now. Some people are going to listen to it, and and if people would want to, they can hit us up at ginandtantra@gmail.com, or certainly leave a comment. We'd like to get this, or you can hit us up on the gram at the Gin and Tantra podcast, which people do, which we appreciate. So we're able to reach people all around the world. You know what I mean? Obviously, we'd like to be more, so please like, subscribe, comment, share, do all those things. But, we get to share the things that are important to us, and hopefully other people feel that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'd like to say like thanks to you, Daniel, for sharing this thing. This has been very clarifying for me doing these episodes. I walk
Yeah.
away with greater clarity. And thanks for the audience, for people who are listening. You inspire us to do this, to be able to communicate with you all. I was thinking about that specifically with this because this is very clarifying for me. So hopefully it helps other people too. But thank you all because it's been clarifying for me.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Eric, gracias a mucho. Everybody else, thank you so much. We'll catch you in the next one. Peace.